Welcome back to the Cyber Kumite. I'm Tim Wainwright. This is Chris Salerno. And with us today, Mike Pinch. Today's Kumite is brought to you by our sponsor, Zero. Zero is the only zero trust platform bold enough to try to trademark the word zero, so you know it's got to be good. Mike, thanks for joining us. You were the first person to tell me about the NIST 800-207 publication for Zero Trust. It's now in second draft and open for comments. First question, did you comment?
No, I haven't put in a formal comment just yet, but I would. This is one of the probably some of the better documentation that NIST has put out. I think Zero Trust is an interesting segment and something that unfortunately, as happens in our industry, is being butchered by a lot of security vendors out there. I think anybody today who's got a VPN solution or anything that has anything to do with the network has now rebadged their website Zero Trust. And so I will put the plug in that what NIST has put together is really, a pretty good academic, technology agnostic write-up on what Zero Trust really is conceptually, and they give a couple different technical mechanisms to solve it, agent-based and network-based. And if you are interested in the concepts of Zero Trust, rather than going to your favorite vendor's website, I would definitely start with the NIST 800-207 documentation.
I agree. Great document. The only part that lost my interest was actually at the very end when they kind of map it to other government initiatives, and I was like, well, I guess they have to do that because they're NIST. Yeah. But the rest of it I thought was really practical.
Yeah,
it was a great read. I agree.
One of the things that I'll point out and maybe come back to later is the difference between the first draft and the second draft. I think I noticed in the second draft they took out the sentence that said, adopting a zero trust framework will require a wholesale replacement of all of your network architecture.
I wonder how many comments they got on that in the first round. Yeah,
I'm thinking that was a little bit of too bold of a statement to drive this concept forward, but I tend to agree with it.
So, Mike, for those who haven't read NIST 800-207 and read the lengthy document, give us Zero Trust in about a minute.
So Zero Trust conceptually is a network and security architecture philosophy that says every connection between any resources and every connection between any two resources that you own or operate should be evaluated in real time to see if it should be allowed. And so that effectively means, having a cookie or having, a source IP address on a trusted network, or having some sort of, an established session should not be enough to grant you access to a resource. Whether that resource is a domain controller, an IoT coffee machine, or, a database somewhere. Every single one of those connections should be evaluated for whether it's still proper, allowed, and necessary based on all of your holistic knowledge of each and every one of those requests. So things like users, user identity, device health, IP addresses, all of these things should be rolled up and be able to be enforced in real time on every single connection.
So, Mike, there's a lot there, right? What have you seen as the top challenges in implementing a ZTA?
So the top challenge, and this is something I tell people a lot, is there's many challenges to it. One is cutting through a lot of the vendor FUD, which I mentioned earlier. But true zero trust on your network is what I described. It's every connection, which means it's not something that you just put in one corner of your network and do it part-time. It's really for everything. And so the top challenges, one of the things I tell people is, and to my earlier point about what that sentence they took out of NIST, is that it can change a lot of the network decisions that you're making in terms of what you invest in, from security technology and other things. Networks typically have a 5 or a 10-year lifespan, and so it makes drastic changes to, one of the implicit ramifications of zero trust is you can kind of treat your network like a flat network, like a coffee shop network. Mm-hmm. You don't need to create zones where you are putting devices and then having special firewall rules for those zones, that sort of thing. And so it can re-architect how you think about your whole network design and have much bigger, broader implications outside of just security. And one of the most common things, the use cases that are so common right now are, with COVID-19 and the preponderance of people working from home, all of a sudden a whole lot more stress got put on VPN systems. Companies learned that maybe our employees can function from home more effectively, and maybe remote work is more in our future. And so a lot of organizations are now looking at zero trust types of tools and technologies as a way to lessen the dependency on VPN. Because if you think about it, VPN is kind of this is a very old technology. It is something that if you need access to one website, you connect on VPN and you have full access potentially to the whole internal network, company network.
It was always possible with VPNs to do more restriction. I think we just found in practice a lot of organizations didn't bother with it, right? So if you had an Ep.6 VPN and then even later the SSL VPNs, they could still be over permission. So you're kind of getting into the area maybe of identity-aware proxies now as a potential replacement for VPNs.
Yeah, and I think VPN has a lifespan and will continue to have a lifespan for power users, administrators, things like that. But for the average everyday user, you're giving them way too much internal network access, exposing yourself to way too much risk, and going through, frankly, a lot more hassle than you might need to necessarily go through from the end user perspective. So I think business leadership in a lot of organizations now are starting to see, an opportunity to make access more seamless, and security is seeing this rare alignment where business wants, more acute access to the things that they need more directly and more quickly, and all of a sudden security is seeing a whole lot less, surface area of attack if they can start to roll back this VPN access.
Do you think, Mike, that identity-aware proxies are today mature enough to take over the work of the traditional remote access VPN?
No, not really. I think we're very early in identity-aware proxies. So as you guys are probably familiar, like Google, for example, has BeyondCore, at which they give away kind of for free, and they actually have kind of a paid product version of it now where the technology is free, and I think you can run it in their cloud. So ultimately, you're using some of their cloud resources for it. But it's still super early in its infancy. When there's free products out there like that are doing it and leading the way, there's definitely a lot more room to grow in that space. There are some products from some other vendors. I know Zscaler is a really common one as well that provides proxying and identity-aware proxies. But it's still, a lot of this is in its infancy. Like they're still very, I would say that the most common product or technology that you see in the market now is kind of like a modification of VPN where, yes, you're proxying your traffic through some sort of identity-aware proxy, and they layer on a little bit of maybe posture assessment on the device you're coming from. Mm-hmm. And that's great. I would say that, especially after you read the NIST white papers and things on it, that's this reactive thing where you can say posture assess the device and then take an action and limit its network connectivity. That's great. But think about that at a much bigger scale. And that's what zero trust is going to and needs to become, where it's not just, we're going to look at the posture of this device. You might want to look at, yes, the posture of that device, a whole lot of things on that device, but you also want to weave in all of your traditional security signals that you're getting. So intrusion detection systems, threat intelligence feeds, antivirus logs and alerts, and having all of those things be able to work in real time to influence what types of network access each device and each user might have. I think that's the big picture for it that is largely missing. And so what we're seeing in the industry is really you might get a solution that has maybe a little bit of this posture assessment and identity proxying, but to really achieve the dream of zero trust, you have to start integrating and stitching together all these other security signals and sources that you have, which goes to my like main theory of like I actually see zero trust as probably the best conceptual enforcement arm of SOAR. As you know, SOAR, security orchestration, automation and response, is kind of that next step past SIM, where you have events that bubble up in your SIM and you want to automate talking to various APIs to respond to incidents automatically. SOAR is a great way to, Zero Trust is one of the very best ways that you can actually take that intelligence, put your SOAR to use, actually enact that and enforce that on the via zero trust. And so that's where I actually see all this kind of going is zero trust becomes the enforcement arm of your SOAR solutions.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and I'm sure the SOAR platforms would be thrilled to jump on the ZTA bandwagon if they haven't already. So if any of them are listening, you're welcome. Pinch just gave you some marketing ideas.
Yes.
But Mike, we kind of jumped right into some of the point solutions, which I like because I think that's helpful. Let's talk about how this is practical. But then you also kind of brought it back to what are the goals, and so let's talk about kind of the architecture options for just a minute here. So the NIST publication talks about 3 different types of architectures. One is identity governance, one's microsegmentation, and the other is software-defined network. Kind of first part of that, does that whole discourse that they do in that really matter, or because is a zero trust solution going to ultimately be a hybrid of these types of things, or are those really distinct? If they're distinct, what would be best for the typical enterprise?
So there definitely different approaches that I don't know whether they'll converge or not. But I guess just to summarize what you described there, probably in more layman's terms, I would say even there's really just kind of 2 models I think are most important to understand. And one is kind of an agent-based solution where you've got all your devices have some sort of agent or something running on them, and they're tunneling their traffic through some sort of a proxy, or everything has an agent and the agents talk to each other in some way, and it allows and disallows traffic that way. And what you're doing there is you're basically saying every single endpoint needs to be running this agent for us to establish trust and enforce trust. And it's kind of like really intelligent host-based firewalling, combined with a lot of this stuff. So that's kind of one model that struggles with, IoT devices, for example, where you can't necessarily install an agent, or printers, for example, that sort of stuff. But then the other model, the identity-aware proxies, are more of a man in the middle. So they sit on your network at some sort of a concentration point where all this traffic has to come through and can be monitored there. That's great because you don't need agents. Nobody likes agents all that much. Downside is, we encrypt our traffic. We expect our traffic to be encrypted, and so it is challenging to decrypt and inspect traffic. And it gets even more challenging. It's a relatively well solved problem today to inspect, HTTPS traffic and that sort of thing. But for all of your other protocols that are, stateful in nature, it's a lot harder to inspect and encrypt and de-encrypt that traffic without breaking some of your protocols. Think about things like SSH and stuff like that. So I guess, long term, there's no one model that works best everywhere. And it's probably unrealistic to say that you could solve all of your problems and get 100% of your solutions through one of these types of models. But if you're going into zero trust, you can think about it that way: is, are we going to try and establish this model where we're going to set up these proxies that we're going to tunnel our traffic through, or do we want to go this sort of agent-based approach? And that's, we mentioned Zscaler and Google earlier. That's kind of their model. Is Zscaler has agents, and they push it through some proxies that they work together to inspect traffic, and then Google's is more of a man-in-the-middle type of an approach. So you can go either way with it.
Mike, ultimately, we're doing all this work with zero trust, and organizations are looking at it in order to really improve their defensive posture and protect against some of the most common attacks out there, and even some of the custom ones. So put your red team hat on for a second. I know it's been a while. What does that look like from the attacker side? Are there still ways to subvert zero trust, even if you implement this thing really well? And are there dangers of doing it halfway?
Yeah, I think zero trust is it depends on how you do it. From a red teamer's perspective, one of the most common sort of entry points to like even be able to initiate conversations with a zero trust security framework is generally certificates, right? So cryptographic certificate validation, ensuring that we know what your endpoint is and that it's a managed endpoint, right? And so that can be hard. So I think one of the things that it does is I actually think that zero trust, one of the technologies that it kind of rolls back might be network access control a little bit, because go ahead, get access to our network, but if you've got a security model that won't accept any traffic on your network unless you present a valid device certificate, then that's pretty good. So it puts the attacker more in the realm of needing to compromise an endpoint and get a point of presence on a managed device of some kind and escalate from there. So that already ups the challenge a little bit. And then it just depends on, how deep you're going with it. So, a traditional solution, or I'd say a lot of the solutions today, if it's merely looking at device behavior and presenting certificates, then it's not going to present a lot more challenges if and when you get a point of presence on an endpoint or device. But if you are, folding in all of your security signals and have integrated it with SOAR and things, it becomes, I think, much more challenging, because you start to get into this model where you need to, say you need to move laterally, and you might be able to, compromise some local credentials on a device and try and move laterally. If any of the security tools in that infrastructure start to see attempts to move laterally, or say your UBA says, hey, this person doesn't typically RDP to anybody, and now they're trying to RDP around the network, that can and should theoretically result in an immediate blacklist, or just saying, hey, you can't use port 3389 anymore for RDP. And so you can start to roll back network permissions granularly and say, like, guess what, you only get 443 from now on until we figure this out. So I do think it is it will make the red team attacks a little bit harder, but the challenging point, I think, is maybe what it's really doing is there's got to be, until you have a solution for unmanaged devices, that's really the challenge. Is with zero trust, you have to establish trust, and you don't establish trust in most cases until you know what the device is and what's going on that device. So IoT, things you don't manage, BYOD, that's a lot of the challenge point. And so I think maybe from a red team perspective, it becomes something that you have to start going after printers and other things, and finding workarounds, finding the gaps and where they've sort of whitelisted things. The one thing I will say that I think is cool, just to tie it into the news cycle a little bit, something I saw the other day was there was a news article about eBay, and users were using eBay, and a security researcher found that when he went to post an item on eBay, eBay port scanned his device, like immediately. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, you know what? That sounds like about the most you can do to try and establish some element of trust on a device that you don't manage. So you can look at its IP address, but if you port scan that device and it's got an SMTP server open to the internet on it, or RDP open and other things, you could actually start to say, like, hey, this is, maybe it's not a malicious device, but it's clearly an insecure device, and something that we might want to put less trust in because it's more likely to get popped than something else. So I think that's maybe an interesting example. I don't know whether they're actually doing it for that reason or not, but so.
That is interesting.
Well, if you're behind a cable modem, isn't it almost hard to expose something like SMB to the internet or SMTP? Like you got to punch those holes on purpose. I would think the typical user isn't gonna have those conditions on their
system. Most of your
system.
routers, will close that by default, but people find ways to mess up security every day.
Mike, one of the most common and something that some of our organizations have dealt with is ransomware, whether it's a small attack or a large attack, they've seen it in their environments. Is zero trust modeling going to help curb those attacks? Are the attackers going to have to find a different way?
And Mike, before you respond to that, I have to do this. Another sponsor message from Zero, the Zero Trust platform. It doesn't matter what this patent pending platform does. The founder golfs with your CFO. That's Zero. Mike, the question about does Zero Trust architecture help solve ransomware woes?
I mean, it can definitely help, right? And so, one of the things it's not going to do is, zero trust architecture is very much about limiting network connectivity. It's more of a network technology or a concept around network security. And so what it attempts to do is not allow you to access resources that you shouldn't be accessing. But if you've accessed a resource, and you want to execute software on that resource, zero trust conceptually isn't really going to change that. You need to rely on your defense in depth, your EDR, and all that. However, the propagation of ransomware, for the most part, we see ransomware spreading a few different ways. We see ransomware spread either in a worming fashion via blue keep, eternal blue, and those are sort of worming technologies that come across various common services and ports on the network. So 445 for SMB and RDP even. And so theoretically, a zero trust architecture will say that those are not necessarily needed connections based on your user, your profile, your device, your access, and it will not allow those types of connections. Or it may shut down those connections if you try to do too many of them. And so there's an inherent sort of self-healing mechanism to it, I think, if it's done properly. The other propagation technique is, you get domain administrator credentials, and you dump the domain and do a PS exec across all of those machines. That's still going to be initiating a mountain of SMB traffic on port 445 in all likelihood, moving around the network. And so the same sort of network connection applies to that. And so it may change the game. It may force people to compromise your SCCM servers and push software in an authorized fashion, put malicious software in an authorized fashion. So they'll always be finding new ways around some of it. But I think it can definitely help the spread and the propagation, and if implemented properly, will shouldn't allow a lot of those network connections in the first place.
That's great. And Mike, I think we've got time for just one more here. How about ZTA for helping to solve the insider risk problem?
So ZTA, I think from an insider threat problem, it's really only as good as what is authorized, and so if your insider is trying to get access to resources that are that they're authorized to access, it's not going to necessarily stop that. It's going to allow that. I would say that to my earlier sort of description of the grand vision of ZT is that you should be able to stitch in all of your different security signals and tools. And so say it's accumulating intelligence off of share drives, intellectual property off of share drives. There are products, companies like Varonis, for example, that look at anomalous behavior and saying, hey, this person's aggregating a ton of data for no good reason, and this is not normal for them. That's the type of signal that you could ingest into your SIM, fire through your SOAR, and immediately block, share drive access for that user, via zero trust as the enforcement point. And so, yes, it can, but you need to have a mature security environment to be able to actually use it to enforce those things. And that's sort of that next level beyond just the basic, buying the zero trust products. It's really, and that's my big thesis on all of zero trust, is it's stitching all these different security signals together and connecting all of them so that you can enforce, based on anything you're seeing on the network.
That's great, Mike. I think that this is a natural breaking point in the topic, and it may well be warranted to open this one up again on the Cyber Kumite in the future. Thanks for being with us. Our guest has been Mike Pinch. I'm Tim Wainwright, and Chris Salerno is here with us. And I'm reminding you once again that I taught Chris everything he knows.
And I'm Chris Salerno, and I forgot the password to that encrypted volume years ago.